Reading the Times for Monday, January 13th, 2020. Reading the Times for Monday, January 13th, 2020. Esper says he saw no evidence Iran targeted four embassies as story shifts again. The challenge for the Trump administration is persuading the public, which has been skeptical about intelligence use to justify military action since President George W. Bush invaded Iraq in 2003 based on what turned out to be inaccurate intelligence, indicating that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Under the United Nations Charter, the United States cannot use force in another country without its consent or the authority of the Security Council, except in response to an armed attack or threat of an imminent armed attack. While the Defense Secretary revealed on CBS that he had not seen intelligence indicating four embassies were targeted, he sounded more supportive of Mr. Trump's claim on CNN's State of the Union. What the president said in regard to the four embassies is what I believe as well, he said, seeming to make a distinction between belief and specific intelligence. Iran cracks down as protests over downing of airliner grow. Ali Vaez, Iran project director at the International Crisis Group, said that even as they took tough measures to suppress protests at home, Iranian leaders might lash out against Washington, covertly or otherwise. The game will return to Iran's comfort zone, indirect attacks against the United States and its allies in ways that would allow plausible deniability and minimal risks of reprisal. Over the last year, the Trump administration has hit Iran with so-called maximum pressure campaign of painful economic sanctions aimed at pressuring Tehran to submit to new restrictions on its military activities and nuclear program. Iran is proud, and the whole world has seen our power. By acknowledging belatedly that Iran's own military had brought down the jet, Iranian leaders avoided the prospect of greater international isolation. American history textbooks can differ across the country in ways that are shaded by partisan politics. Each textbook has editions for Texas and California, among other states, customized to satisfy policymakers with different priorities. The differences between state editions can be traced back to several sources: state social studies standards, state laws, and feedback from panels of appointees that huddle in Sacramento and Austin hotel conference rooms to review drafts. At the time the Texas edition was produced, 6 years ago, state standards called for students to analyze both legal and illegal immigration to the United States. In contrast, California textbooks are more likely to note when a historical figure was an immigrant. I lost my legs wounded in Iraq. He sued Iran. His name may not have been well known to most Americans, but the general had long been a focus of anger for many wounded veterans and families of those killed in Iraq. American officials have blamed General Soleimani for a campaign of roadside bombs and other attacks that they say killed hundreds of troops at the height of the Iraq War, which took the lives of nearly 4,500 American service members and left more than 30,000 wounded. Last week, as White House claims that the general was killed to ward off imminent attack on Americans were called into question, the administration sought to bolster its justification for the missile strike by also focusing on his role during the Iraq War. Joe Biden's vote for war. The vote has exposed him to direct and implicit criticism from his chief presidential rivals, including Senator Elizabeth Warren and former Mayor Pete Buttigieg, a military veteran, and especially Senator Bernie Sanders, who voted against the war as a Vermont congressman and whose campaign has sharpened its criticism of Mr. Biden in recent days. On Saturday, the Sanders campaign released a blistering statement excoriating Mr. Biden for his Iraq war vote. At a campaign stop in Des Moines this month, Mr. Biden said the president then went ahead with shock and awe, and right after that, and from the very moment he did that, right after that, I opposed what he was doing. A misleading assertion at best, according to an assessment from CNN. Mr. Biden did ultimately become a vocal opponent of the Bush administration's stewardship of the war, and went on to serve as vice president to Barack Obama, a critic of the conflict. Me Too cases new legal battleground, defamation lawsuits. Men like Mr. Depp are using defamation suits to fend off allegations from women. In his case, his ex-wife Amber Heard, who accused him of domestic abuse. At the same time, backers of the Me Too movement fear that the spate of defamation cases against women will push victims back into the shadows. In countries without the same high bar, including China, Australia, and France, men have won high-profile defamation cases against women or news outlets that published their stories. A new home for French socialists on Paris's periphery. For decades, the headquarters of the Socialist Party, which held France's presidency until just a couple of years ago, was ensconced in the heart of Paris. A stroll to the nation's top schools, the Orsay and Louvre museums, the National Assembly, and across the Seine, the Élysée Palace. The symbol we sought was to be able to say that we are, once again, among those we're called to represent, said Olivier Faure, the party's Secretary General, adding that the party's former supporters had sometimes felt abandoned once we were in power. Like all parties in France, from the extreme left to the extreme right, the socialists were keenly aware of the rising importance of the environment as an electoral issue. Ontario alert warned of a nuclear emergency, then backed down. The previous alert was issued in error, the second message read. There's no danger to the public or environment. A false alarm over a possible emergency at the Pickering Nuclear Generating Station, which sits on the shore of Lake Ontario to the east of Ontario, is the latest embarrassment for Canada's National Emergency Alert System, which was expanded to phone from broadcast warnings just over a year and a half ago. Sylvia Jones, who is responsible for the emergency alert system as the province's Solicitor General, said in a statement that the alert was unintentionally released to the public during a routine training exercise being conducted by the Provincial Emergency Operations Center. She added that the government would investigate and introduce steps to ensure no repeat false alarms occur. The federally mandated alert system has struggled with technical issues that resulted in early test messages failing to reach large numbers of phones. Warnings of volcanic tsunami after eruption in Philippines. Tremors were felt on the volcano's island and in villages around the nearby town of Agoncillo in Batangas province, and booming noises from the volcano raised fears among residents. The Institute warned that the eruption could cause a volcanic tsunami and advised nearby communities to take precautions against possible surges from the lake that surrounds the volcano. Last January, as eruption at the most active volcano in the island nation, the Mayon in Albay province, about 200 miles east of Taal, prompted an alert of 4 as it generated up to 1,600 feet of lava fountains and ash fell on 2 nearby villages. Australia's leader calls for inquiry into government responses to fires. Prime Minister Scott Morrison of Australia said on Sunday that he will call for a high-level government inquiry into the response to the country's devastating bushfires. The journalist who interviewed Mr. Morrison on Sunday, David Spears, said afterward that the Prime Minister's call for a historic change, mostly involving how resources are used to combat disasters, felt short of what many Australians were hoping to hear, a plan for a significant shift in his government's policies to curb emissions and invest more in renewable energy. Climate scientists say that the government's targets are low to begin with, and that emissions have been rising under Mr. Morrison's government. Diego, the tortoise whose high sex drive helped save his species, retires. A member of the Chelonoidus hudensis, or the giant tortoise species from Hispaniola Island in the Galapagos in Ecuador, said he was one of 15 tortoises in a captive breeding program at the Fausto Llerena Tortoise Center on the island of Santa Cruz. The program began in 1965, with efforts first dedicated to saving the tortoise population on Pinzon Island, another island in the Galapagos. The social hierarchies and relationships of giant tortoises are very poorly known. Mr. Carrion, the director of the national park, had a simpler explanation. Without a doubt, Diego had some characteristics that made him special. Professor Gibbs said the giant tortoises became endangered because easy access to the island allowed whalers, pirates, fishermen, and others to remove them for food, primarily in the 1800s. France summons African leaders, threatening troop pullout. France has called 5 African presidents to a meeting on Monday to disavow rising anti-French hostility in their countries, work out how to stop the rapid advance of armed Islamic extremists in the region, and determine whether France will remain deeply engaged in that fight. Urban Malians are demanding the departure of Operation Barkhane, the French counterterrorism force, while protesters in the capital Bamako chant slogans against France and have burned the French flag. Mr. Perus de Monclos, the French author of Une guerre perdue, France au Sahel, said France would be better off getting out. Hong Kong denies entry to Human Rights Watch director, group says. The head of an international human rights group who had planned to criticize China's growing global influence at an event in Hong Kong said he was barred from entry on Sunday on the latest sign of eroding freedom in the city. The local government is under pressure from the authorities in Beijing to restore order as well as defend its image abroad. Human Rights Watch noted that Mr. Roth had previously visited Hong Kong many times, including in April 2018, to draw attention to a report on gender discrimination in the Chinese job market. In October, the general manager of the Houston Rockets, Daryl Morey, posted an image on Twitter supporting pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong, and LeBron James faced backlash for saying that Mr. Morey wasn't educated on the situation at hand. In December, China announced it would impose sanctions against several pro-democracy nonprofit organizations based in the United States, including Human Rights Watch. Libyan rivals announce a truce in the battle for Tripoli. Libya's warring parties have agreed to a ceasefire that took effect after midnight on Saturday, stoking fragile hopes for an end to months of escalating foreign-backed fighting around Tripoli, the capital that had threatened to push the country into a major conflagration. Mr. Putin lobbied other countries to press for the ceasefire on Saturday, making phone calls to the leaders of the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, which back opposing sides in Libya. Mr. Hifter's campaign to capture Tripoli is backed by the United Arab Emirates, which launched airstrikes by warplanes and drones, and by a contingent of Kremlin-backed Russian mercenaries that arrived last fall. A growing U.S. base made this Afghan town. Now it's dying. 9 years ago, Fakullah Tajik helped sort laundry at Bagram Air Base, the largest American military outpost in Afghanistan. The base's size at the height of the war, when more than 100,000 American troops were in Afghanistan, meant that 80% of the town of Bagram's economy relied on it. Mr. Shakur said, with few Americans and Western troops in the country and more advanced trash facilities on the airbase, Mr. Nassari's business has slumped. Schumer, eyeing Senate's top job, navigates tricky impeachment terrain. Senator Chuck Schumer has a pointed warning when John R. Bolton declared himself willing to testify in President Trump's impeachment trial. Republicans who refuse Democrats' demands for witnesses and documents would be participating in a cover-up. For Mr. Schumer, the voluble New York Democrat and minority leader, the resurfacing of Mr. Bolton, the former White House National Security Advisor, and a potential witness was a way to squeeze vulnerable Republicans like Senator Susan Collins of Maine to cross party lines and effectively give him control of the floor during a historic trial over whether to remove Mr. Trump. The weekend that millions of women took to the streets to protest Trump, Schumer went to the Women's March and the next day had a press conference on the size of overhead bins on airplanes. The world was falling apart, but Chuck Schumer was still doing his Sunday press conferences. Over the past few weeks, as Ms. Pelosi and Senator Mitch McConnell, a Republican of Kentucky and majority leader, engaged in a bitter standoff in recent weeks over the shape of the trial, the Speaker refused to send the articles, while Mr. McConnell refused to commit to hearing any new evidence in the Senate. Mr. Schumer was still pushing daily for a deal with Republicans to hear from witnesses and secure more documents. If Republicans block new evidence, Democrats will deem the trial illegitimate and a sham, he said, adding, pursuing witnesses and documents makes us better off, no matter what the outcome. The position is at odds with the one Mr. Schumer took almost exactly 21 years ago, when he opposed calling witnesses during the impeachment trial of President Bill Clinton. U.S. to expel a dozen Saudi military trainees after Pensacola shooting. About a dozen Saudi students training alongside the American military in the United States will be sent back to Saudi Arabia after a review that stemmed from the killing of 3 American service members at the Naval Air Station in Pensacola, Florida last month, according to a United States official. The review, first reported by CNN, did not find evidence that the Saudi students aided the gunman, who was himself a Saudi trainee, in the December 6th shooting, the official said. The Pentagon in December suspended all operational training for nearly 900 Saudi students across the country and ordered a full review for the thousands of international military personnel from more than 150 countries training alongside the American military. Trump, shifting arguments, urges swift dismissal of impeachment hearings. As the subject of the charges on trial, Mr. Trump has no direct say over how the Senate proceeds, and by all accounts, Republicans do not have the votes needed to dismiss the case, as Mr. Trump suggested, at least not before hearing opening arguments. Ms. Pelosi has said the House will send 2 articles of impeachment charging Mr. Trump with abuse of power and obstruction of Congress sometime this week, with the trial commencing as soon as Wednesday. Appearing Sunday on ABC's This Week, before Mr. Trump's tweet, Ms. Pelosi told senators considering foregoing a full trial that dismissing is a cover-up, and asserted that whatever the outcome, the trial could never erase the stain of impeachment from Mr. Trump's record. Trump's impeachment team takes shape as trial looms. Others may have discrete roles with the team, including the famed lawyer Alan Dershowitz, whose appearances on television have impressed Mr. Trump, and other members of the White House counsel staff. Last week, Mr. Trump's lawyers met at the White House with Stephen R. Castor, who served as a Republican counsel in the House impeachment hearings, according to people briefed in the discussions. On Sunday, Mr. Trump suggested that instead of holding a trial, the Senate should dismiss the House's articles of impeachment that charge him with abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. Trump took credit for lower cancer death rates. Advocates say not so fast. The mortality trends reflected in our current report, including the largest drop in overall cancer mortality ever recorded from 2016 to 2017, reflect prevention, early detection, and treatment advances that occurred in prior years, Gary M. Reedy, the American Cancer Society's chief executive, said in a statement. Mr. Reedy said that since taking office, the president has signed multiple spending bills that increase funding for cancer research at the National Institutes of Health and National Cancer Institute. The death rate for female breast cancer, for example, fell 40% from 1989 to 2017, while the death rate for prostate cancer dropped 52% from 1993 to 2017. If the calendar says January, why does the thermometer say May? At the time of the year when the days are near their shortest and the weather should be near its coldest, temperatures across the region warm to the highs of 60s and low 70s, 30 to 35 degrees above average. The Northeast has not been frozen. The weather in the region has been on mild since mid-December, he said, so the recent record-breaking days were just a change from warm to warmer. For areas where milder winters are the norm, a January warm spell might be better described as a fall spring. The warmth was blown into the Northeast by the jet stream, the powerful atmospheric current that drives weather patterns across the continent. Judge Judy has issued her decision. She likes Michael Bloomberg. In choosing to endorse Mr. Bloomberg, Ms. Shainlin is breaking 5 decades of political silence to publicly back a politician that she sees as the only one who can help America heal. The pairing of Mr. Bloomberg, a 77-year-old former New York mayor, with a 77-year-old Ms. Shainlin, a former Manhattan family court supervising judge, is not all that unlikely a match. Asked about the criticism of Mr. Bloomberg's vast wealth and his decision to self-fund his campaign, Ms. Shainlin cast it as a political strength, saying he holds no constituency other than the people who elected him. Her first journey through the rigors of a day on the presidential campaign came on Saturday when she joined Mr. Bloomberg on a bus tour across Texas. Judge Judy Shainlin is known for her good judgment, says Galia Slain, a spokeswoman for Mr. Bloomberg. Local New Hampshire union backs Bernie Sanders' bucking national affiliate. A local union branch of New Hampshire, state and local employees, said Sunday it had voted to endorse Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont for the Democratic presidential nomination, another labor endorsement from a candidate whose political stock continues to rise less than a month before the Iowa caucuses. The endorsement, which will officially be made on Monday, is particularly notable because the union chapter, SEIU Local 1984, has acted separately from its national affiliate organization, the Service Employees International Union. In a statement, Sarah Leonardo, a spokeswoman for the national union, said SEIU members are paying close attention to this race and are still evaluating candidates on their plans to put power back in the hands of working families and give all working people the ability to join together in unions, no matter where they work. We will continue engaging our members nationwide to determine who they see as the best candidate for our union to endorse. Mr. Sanders has increasingly gathered grassroots support in recent months as the Democratic Party's left wing has rallied around his candidacy. Elizabeth Warren says Bernie Sanders sent volunteers out to trash me. Democrats need to unite our party, and that means pulling in all parts of the Democratic coalition. In a rare question and answer session with reporters after his final event of a weekend Iowa swing, Mr. Sanders, in response to a question on whether he approved of his campaign criticism of Ms. Warren, denied responsibility for the script, saying that he himself has never attacked Ms. Warren. Pressed again on the topic, Mr. Sanders said, "We have hundreds of employees. Elizabeth Warren has hundreds of employees, and people sometimes say things that they shouldn't. You have heard me give many speeches. Have I ever said one negative word about Elizabeth Warren?" The exchange on Sunday, just 2 days after a major Iowa poll showed them in first and second place in the state, was a rare fraying of a de facto non-aggression pact the two senators have shared since the beginning of the primary race. About 25% say that they would be unhappy if Senator Sanders were the nominee. The person that scores the best on that, who people are good with, they would get out there and vote if they're the nominee, is Elizabeth Warren. Still, Mr. Sanders is not the first to try to pigeonhole Miss Warren as the candidate of the elites. On Instagram, houseplant sellers turn likes into green thumbs. Rather than just trying to sell, we create something that is not just about selling plants, but is also about education, said Puneet Sabarwal, 38, who along with Brianna Sortino, 36, runs Horti, a company that offers plants through a subscription service. These plants break down and they contribute to carbon emissions when it wasn't needed from the beginning. Horti, which says it wants to help customers keep their plants out of landfills, is using Instagram to help as much greenery as it can survive. A spokeswoman for Instagram said that the company did not have any information about an uptick in plant sales on the platform, but added that selling plants is popular on Facebook Marketplace. Buying plants on social media carries risks, of course. Why shouldn't New York's wealthiest PTAs share with its neediest schools? Of 132 schools reviewed by the Budget Office in the 2017-2018 school year, the school with the lowest percentage of children living in poverty, 6%, received $437,000 from its PTA, while the school with the highest percent of children living in poverty, 98%, received $2,500. At the same time, many city schools with wealthier students receive more than their share under the Fair Student Funding Formula the city adopted in the 2007-2008 school year, while nearly 300 high-poverty schools had shortfalls of more than $500,000 each, according to the Budget Office. One idea is to take a portion of PTA funding above a certain amount from each New York City school and direct it towards a common, citywide fund that helps high-need schools. FDR got it. Most Democrats don't. Republicans understand a concept that political scientists refer to as policy feedback, namely that policy can influence politics in ways that make future policy changes more or less likely. In the last several years, policy feedback has finally started getting more attention in progressive circles. In climate policy, this would mean putting more emphasis on a green jobs program than on a hated carbon tax. Boris Johnson might break up the UK. That's a good thing. England need not be, as many fear, a rump United Kingdom, parochial, perhaps even irredentist. British World War II propaganda explained that the United Kingdom was just one equal element of a British Commonwealth of nations that, along with India and the colonies, made up the British Empire. It was the empire that fought the war, not the United Kingdom. No one died for the United Kingdom. After 1945, Britain, a national United Kingdom, was one of the many post-imperial constructions that emerged from the ashes of the British Empire. Latino voters will decide the 2020 election. Despite the Obama administration's failures with regard to the Hispanic community, many 2020 Democratic candidates, as well as the party itself, find it difficult to criticize a former president. If Democrats really want to win Hispanic votes in the November 3rd election, they must stop making excuses and promise to avoid President Obama's mistakes. The Hispanic population is much more than an electoral fad. As the iconic Hispanic labor leader Cesar Chavez said, "We have seen the future, and the future is ours." Trump's weakening of environmental rules would leave the public in the dark. Often called the Magna Carta of environmental laws, the 1970 National Environmental Policy Act requires that major energy and infrastructure projects receiving federal funding or requiring federal approval must undergo environmental reviews. Mr. Trump's proposed changes will reduce the number of projects subject to such reviews by setting new criteria for what qualifies as major federal action requiring review, by excluding projects deemed to be minimal. It's not possible, from the vague language in the proposed rules, to predict which kinds of projects may escape reasonable reviews, but the enthusiastic response to the proposed changes from the oil, gas, and construction industries offers a clue. Not all federally approved or funded projects even end up receiving extensive environmental review. The soaring rate of suicide by young people. Dr. Friedman's assertion that a visit to a family physician or a therapist and medication are the first steps to treatment ignores the fact that we face a dire shortage of medical professionals, especially psychiatrists like Dr. Friedman himself, who can properly prescribe medication and provide accompanying therapy, the combination proven most effective in treating both depression and anxiety. A 2019 University of Michigan study showed that previously suicidal teens were more likely to be alive 11 to 14 years later if the adults caring for them received education about depression and suicide. Something as accessible as a webinar or workshop on teen depression can help parents on the right track to supporting their teen. Making sure our antibiotics remain potent. Your article about the antibiotic crisis offers an alarming forecast on what could happen to the entire drug industry if arbitrary price controls preclude the possibility of profits sufficient to compensate for the cost, time, and risk of drug development. Until new drugs are developed, it is imperative that the World Health Community reduce the overuses of antibiotics. In 2018, despite growing alarm over antibiotic resistance, beef and pork producers bought even more antibiotics considered important to human medicine than they did in 2017. She hustled to create her art, then unemployment hit. In the 1980s, Carolyn Coleman was an artsy high school student in Louisville, Kentucky. One summer, a friend returned from an extended trip to New York City with treasures that Miss Coleman remembers to this day. In the 2 years that followed, Miss Coleman worked in retail, did freelance textile design, and made displays for Tower Records before giving California a shot. In December, Miss Coleman graduated from the program, and she is eager to re-enter the workforce with help from recruiters she met through Grace. Lawmakers got lurid accusations about a state senator from his brother. Over the past few days, state senators have received a rambling 13-page letter accusing a Bronx Democratic senator of a series of appalling crimes ranging from child molestation to drug trafficking. To make matters more bizarre, even by Albany standards, the letter was sent from prison by the senator's incarcerated brother. The senator promised to visit him in prison soon and urged him to keep the faith. "You have abandoned me here with no communication or your help," the incarcerated brother wrote in his letter. Officials call red men a racist mascot. Then voters weighed in. In July, the school board in small Connecticut town called Killingly took what local officials said was a long overdue step, removing the name of the school mascot, Red Men, that some Native Americans have deemed racist. In May, Maine banned the use of Native American mascots in its public schools and colleges. Tara Huska, a lawyer who is Native American and the co-founder of Not Your Mascots, an advocacy group fighting against the stereotypical representation of Native Americans in sports, said she was surprised by the move in Killingly. Carlos Ghazin skipped bail. This man was left behind. Every weekday morning, Greg Kelly, the former Nissan executive, accused of helping Carlos Ghazin hide his compensation from the Japanese authorities, makes his way to his lawyer's office in Tokyo to chip away at the monumental task, reviewing close to 1 billion pages of documents. Prosecutors have barred his lawyers from putting the voluminous documents in his case online and making them searchable, which means that only Mr. Kelly's Japanese defense team or others who come to their Tokyo offices can see them. Mr. Kelly has insisted on helping to review the mountain of documents prosecutors say they will use to make their case. How police use facial recognition and where it falls short. So investigators turned to one of the oldest and largest facial recognition systems in the country, a statewide program based in Pinellas County, Florida, that began almost 20 years ago, when law enforcement agencies were just starting to use the technology. Although officials said investigators could not rely on facial recognition results to make an arrest, documents suggested that on occasion officers gathered no other evidence. Still, together with related court documents, records were readily available for about half the cases. The list offers insights into which crimes facial recognition is best suited to help solve: shoplifting, check forgery, ID fraud. The decimation of local news has Lawmakers crossing the aisle. The proposal would give news organizations an exemption from antitrust laws, allowing them to band together to negotiate with Google and Facebook over how their articles and photos are used online and what payments the newspapers get from the tech companies. The companies also work with news organizations to promote their articles and videos, driving traffic to their websites. Facebook has never featured articles from Mr. Nesmith's newspaper chain in its Today In feature, an aggregation of local news from the nation's smallest papers that can drive a lot of traffic to a news site. This week in tech, new decade, same old trouble in Washington. Facebook's tough week kicked off with a Times report on an internal company post by Andrew Bosworth, a senior executive of Facebook and self-described liberal, who warned against actions that could thwart President Trump in the 2020 election. Alexis Madrigal of The Atlantic explained why Mr. Bosworth's internal post was so divisive and why Facebook's id is showing. Mr. Bosworth argued that Facebook did not really need to change. On Thursday, Facebook was back to serious news. It released its policy on political ads, cementing a decision to allow lies by politicians to go unchecked and for campaigns to micro-target those ads to specific audiences. How a high schooler scooped everyone on the Iowa poll. At 5:39 p.m. on Friday, Arjav Rowell just tweeted it out. Mr. Rowell, 18, is a senior at Dublin High School in the Bay Area. How does Mr. Rowell do it? He correctly figures out the URL, the Uniform Resource Locator or full web address, that a graphic depicting the poll's results appears at before their official release. Mona Lisa of Mustangs, raced in Bullet, sets auction record. It's a record auction price for any Mustang ever sold, said Dana Meckham, the principal of the auction house, Meckham Auctions, that sold the car. Mr. Kiernan's father, Bob, happily bought the car with all its dings and dents after the movie wrapped. McQueen, who died of cancer in 1980, tried to buy back the car in 1977 when he tracked down Mr. Kiernan's father. Los Angeles rethinks taxis as Uber and Lyft dominate the streets. Press officers for Uber and Lyft declined to provide information on the number of drivers who operate in Los Angeles, but both described the market as important. Los Angeles is unusual in that many taxis are summoned by passengers calling a dispatcher, not by waving one down. Interviewing the students afterwards, Miss Brown said they felt the unreliability of taxis did not end when they got in the car. They didn't know how much the trip would be. There wasn't always a recourse if they were unsatisfied with the driver. Uber and Lyft, they could complain and get their money back. It is these issues that Los Angeles is trying to address with its new taxi permit system. Its excessive rules and regulations that the city has had for many years to control every aspect of our business, said Simon Momen-Nassab, the general manager of Bell Cab, which operates 200 taxis in Los Angeles. Labor Department rule to curb lawsuits by franchise workers. Workers would have more difficulty suing large companies for wrongdoing by contractors or franchisees under a rule announced on Sunday by the Labor Department. A company could be considered a joint employer of a contractor's employees if it provided facilities and equipment for the workers and if the workers were easy to replace, even if the company didn't supervise the workers or hire and fire them. Under a ruling the Labor Board handed down during the Obama administration, a company could be considered a joint employer of workers at a contractor or franchisee if it exercised direct control over them, not if it exercised indirect control over them, not just direct control. Go ahead and complain. It might be good for you. In short, yes, it's good to complain. Yes, it's bad to complain. And yes, there's a right way to do it. Dr. Kowalski said, we're not very good at expressing our feelings as a society, so it's pretty common to complain in order to express a feeling, said Tina Gilbertson, a psychotherapist and the author of Constructive Wallowing. And since, as she said, anytime we are sharing emotional content with someone, that is a vehicle for bonding. We're especially fond of using complaining as a social tool. How much complaining is good for you? How long is a piece of string? You want to avoid what Dr. Grice calls wearing muddy glasses, where no matter what's going on, you always find something to complain about. And that has been Reading the Times for Monday, January 13th, 2020. Reading the Times for Monday, January 13th, 2020.